My stepmother announced she was cutting me from Dad's will. At the reading, the lawyer started laughing. Hey, Reddit. So my stepmother thought she'd pull a power move at my dad's will reading and announced she was cutting me out of everything. The lawyer literally started laughing. This is going to be a long one, so grab whatever and settle in because this revenge was 30 years in the making. I'm going to start from the beginning because you need the full context of how absolutely bonkers this woman has been my entire life. My mom died when I was 7. Car accident, completely random, devastating for everyone involved. My dad was absolutely shattered. He was a quiet guy, the kind who showed love through actions rather than words, and losing mom basically broke something in him. He tried his best with me, but I could tell he was drowning in grief and work and just trying to keep our lives together. Enter Patricia. Dad met her about 2 years after mom passed. I was 9 at the time, still very much a kid who missed his mom and wasn't exactly thrilled about some random woman trying to fill that role. Patricia was the complete opposite of my mom in every possible way. Where my mom was warm and genuine, Patricia was cold and calculating. Where my mom actually cared about people, Patricia cared about appearances and status and money. But my dad was lonely and vulnerable, and Patricia knew exactly how to work that angle. She played the perfect girlfriend for about 6 months, then the perfect fiancé for another 6 months, and by the time I was 10, she was my stepmother, and moving into our house with her daughter Jessica from her previous marriage. Jessica was 8, and honestly, she was fine at first, just a normal kid. But Patricia immediately started this campaign of making Jessica the golden child, and me the problem child. Every little thing I did was wrong. Every achievement Jessica had was the most incredible thing ever witnessed by human eyes. I'm not exaggerating when I say Patricia made it her life's mission to make me feel like an unwanted guest in my own home. And the worst part? My dad either didn't notice or didn't want to rock the boat because he was so desperate not to be alone again. Let me give you some examples of how this woman operated. When I was 11, I made the school honor roll for the first time. Brought home my report card all excited, thinking maybe this would be the thing that made Patricia see me as something other than an obstacle. My dad gave me a proud smile and a pat on the shoulder, started to say something nice, and Patricia literally cut him off mid-sentence to announce that Jessica had gotten picked to be in the school play. Not even the lead role, just a background part where she'd stand there holding a fake tree or something. But according to Patricia, this was evidence of Jessica's incredible natural talent and star quality. My report card went on the fridge for about 2 hours before Patricia took it down to make room for Jessica's play announcement. When I pointed this out, Patricia told me I was being selfish for trying to steal Jessica's moment. When I was 13, I started mowing lawns around the neighborhood to save up for a bike. Spent the whole summer working in the heat, doing quality work, building up a good reputation with the neighbors. Started at 7 in the morning on weekends to beat the worst heat, came home sunburned and exhausted, but satisfied because I was building something for myself. The neighbors loved me because I actually did thorough work, edged properly, cleaned up the clippings, didn't half-effort it like most kids would. Word spread, and soon I had a regular client list. By August, I had enough saved up for this really nice mountain bike I'd been eyeing at the local shop. 21 speeds, good suspension, the kind of bike that would last years if I took care of it. I'd been going by the shop every week to look at it, make sure it was still there, imagining the rides I'd take once it was mine. I was so proud of myself for earning it through actual work. The day before I was supposed to go buy it, Patricia sat me down at the kitchen table with this serious expression like she was about to deliver bad news. Explained in this careful voice that Jessica really wanted to go to this expensive summer camp next year, the kind with horseback riding and arts programs and whatever else rich kids do in the woods. Wouldn't it be nice, Patricia suggested, if I contributed my savings to help fund Jessica's camp experience? You know, to show family unity and support, to prove I cared about my sister's happiness and development. When I said no, that was my money that I'd earned through my own work, Patricia's face went cold, told me I was being selfish. That family means sacrifice. That Jessica would do the same for me if our positions were reversed, which we both knew was absolutely false. When I still refused, Patricia spent the next 3 days giving me the silent treatment and telling my dad I was being divisive and creating conflict in the family. Said I was teaching Jessica that money was more important than relationships. My dad, bless him, actually stood up for me on that one. Told Patricia that I earned that money and I got to decide what to do with it. I got my bike. But Patricia made sure to punish me for it in little ways for months afterward. Forgot to include me in dinner plans. Forgot to do my laundry when she did everyone else's. Forgot to pick me up from school when it was her turn. Just constant small cruelties, designed to let me know I'd stepped out of line. High school is where things really ramped up. I was a decent student, played baseball, had a solid group of friends. Nothing spectacular, but I was doing fine. Jessica was in theater and choir, and according to Patricia, she was basically the next Meryl Streep, despite having the stage presence of a cardboard cutout. Every single one of Jessica's performances required the whole family to attend. Every rehearsal was treated like a Broadway opening night. Every minor role was cause for celebration and expensive gifts. Meanwhile, I had baseball games that Patricia refused to attend, citing various excuses about being too busy or too tired or having a headache. My dad would come to my games when he could, but he worked long hours running his own small accounting firm, and Patricia made sure to schedule conflicts whenever possible. Doctor's appointments for Jessica, mandatory parent-teacher conferences, suddenly critical errands that only Patricia could handle, but that somehow required my dad's presence too. Junior year, I made varsity as a starting pitcher. Pretty big deal at our school. The team had a tradition where parents of varsity players would host the preseason barbecue. When it was our turn, Patricia told the coach that we couldn't host because our house was being renovated. Total lie. We weren't renovating anything. She just didn't want to spend money or effort on something related to me. I found out later she told the other parents that I'd insisted we couldn't host because I was embarrassed about our house. Made me look like a snobby jerk for no reason. But here's where things get really important to the story. My dad's business was doing really well. Like, really well. He'd built up this accounting firm from nothing, had major corporate clients, was pulling in serious money, and he was old school about it. Didn't flaunt wealth, didn't buy fancy cars or take expensive vacations. He saved and invested and planned for the future. Around the time I was 15, my dad sat me down and told me that he'd set up a trust fund for me. Nothing I could access until I was 25, but it was there, growing, meant to give me a solid financial foundation when I was ready to really start my adult life. He also told me he'd updated his will to make sure I was taken care of no matter what happened. He made me promise not to tell Patricia or Jessica about the specific amounts or details. Said it was between us, father and son, and that when the time was right, everything would be clear. I didn't fully understand why the secrecy at the time, but I agreed. I think my dad knew, on some level, what Patricia was. I think he saw her manipulation and favoritism. But he was trapped between the woman he'd married and the son he loved, and he didn't know how to fix it without blowing up his entire life again. So he did what he could. He made sure I'd be financially secure, even if he wasn't around to protect me anymore. Senior year, college applications started. I had decent grades, good test scores, solid extracurriculars. I applied to several state schools with good programs for business and finance. My dad encouraged me to dream bigger, apply to some reach schools, but I was practical about it. Knew what was realistic. Jessica was a sophomore, and Patricia was already obsessing over getting her into some prestigious performing arts school, despite Jessica's relatively mediocre talent. But according to Patricia, Jessica just needed the right training and opportunities, and then everyone would see her brilliance. I got accepted to 3 good state schools with partial scholarships to 2 of them. My dad was proud, gave me this whole speech about making good choices and working hard, and how he knew I'd do great things. Patricia's response? She pointed out that partial scholarships meant the family would still have to contribute significant money, and was I sure I needed to go to college at all when I could just work at my dad's firm? Yeah, she literally tried to talk me out of going to college so that more money would be available for Jessica's eventual private school dreams. My dad immediately shut that down, told Patricia that I was going to college, and that was final. But the fact that she'd even suggested it told me everything about how she viewed me. I wasn't family. I was a competitor for resources that should be going to her actual child. I picked a school about 4 hours away, close enough to visit if needed, far enough to get some actual distance from Patricia's constant negativity. Those 4 years of college were honestly some of the best of my life. I studied hard, made great friends, did internships, and most importantly, I wasn't living under Patricia's roof anymore. I'd call my dad every week. He'd tell me about work, about the house, ask about my classes and social life. Sometimes Patricia would get on the phone, and it was always this fake sweet voice asking generic questions, while clearly wanting to get off the call as fast as possible. Jessica never wanted to talk to me. We'd basically become strangers. After I graduated, I got a good job at a financial planning firm in the city where I went to school. Decided to stay there rather than move back home. My dad understood, even if he was disappointed. We'd still talk weekly, and I'd visit on major holidays. But I'd built a life that didn't include Patricia's toxicity, and I was happy. The next decade passed in kind of a blur. I advanced in my career, dated various women, but never found the right one. Bought a small condo, lived a quiet but comfortable life. My dad and I stayed close despite the distance. He'd drive up to visit me every few months. We'd grab dinner, catch up properly without Patricia hovering. During these visits, he'd sometimes hint that things weren't great at home. Never came out and said it directly, but I could read between the lines. Patricia had gotten more controlling over the years. Everything had to be her way. She'd taken over more and more of the household decisions, the finances, the social calendar. My dad had basically retreated into his work, letting her run everything else just to keep the peace. Jessica had gone to an expensive private college for theater, graduated with a basically useless degree, and was now living in New York trying to make it as an actress, which meant Patricia and my dad were still supporting her financially at age 26, because she couldn't book anything beyond unpaid student films and amateur theater productions. But according to Patricia, Jessica was on the verge of her big break and just needed a little more support. Meanwhile, I'd been financially independent since graduation, never asked my parents for a dime after college, built my own career in life. But somehow Jessica's constant need for financial support was noble and artistic, while my independence was me being cold and distant. Patricia's logic: everyone. When I was 31, my dad's health started declining. Nothing dramatic at first, just seemed more tired, less energetic. Said his doctor told him it was stress and getting older, needed to slow down at work. But over the next year it got worse. He started having these episodes where he'd seem confused or disoriented, memory issues, motor skill problems. Finally got a proper diagnosis: early onset dementia, probably a combination of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. Essentially, his brain was deteriorating, and there wasn't much that could be done to stop it. The doctors said he might have 5 to 7 years, but quality of life would decline significantly. I wanted to move home immediately, help take care of him, but Patricia made it clear that my presence would be disruptive and stressful for my dad, that he needed calm and routine, and having me there would upset the household balance. She'd take care of everything. She was his wife, after all. This was her responsibility. My dad, in one of his clearer moments, told me not to fight her on it. Said he needed me to trust that he'd set things up right, that I needed to keep living my life and building my future, and that everything would make sense eventually. Made me promise. So I visited when I could, called constantly, video chatted when he was having good days, watched from 4 hours away as the man who raised me slowly disappeared into confusion and fog. It was brutal. Patricia would send occasional updates, always making sure to mention how hard she was working, how stressful it all was, how devoted she was being. Jessica came home from New York, moved back into the house to help, though from what I could tell, her helping mostly involved posting Instagram stories about being a caregiver and how emotionally draining it was to watch her stepfather decline. Real touching stuff. Dad's firm was being managed by his longtime business partner at this point. The partner and I stayed in touch, and he let me know that Patricia had gotten power of attorney and was making decisions about the business, the finances, everything. Said he didn't love it, but legally there wasn't much anyone could do. She was the spouse, and the legal documents gave her authority once my dad was deemed incapacitated. About 3 years into his decline, my dad passed away. Fairly peaceful, considering. Just went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. Heart gave out quietly, which the doctors said was probably a blessing given where his dementia was headed. I got the call from Patricia at 6 in the morning. Her voice was flat, almost businesslike. She sounded appropriately sad, said all the right things about how peaceful it was, and how he wasn't suffering anymore. Told me the funeral would be in 4 days, that she'd already contacted the funeral home and started making arrangements. Very efficient, very organized, almost like she'd been preparing for this moment. Looking back, I wonder if she'd been mentally planning his funeral for months, calculating what she'd inherit, what her life would look like once he was gone and she had full control of his estate. The thought makes my skin crawl, but knowing Patricia, it wouldn't surprise me. The funeral was strange. Lots of people from my dad's firm, from the community, people whose lives he'd touched. Patricia played the grieving widow perfectly. Black dress, tasteful tears, accepting condolences with grace. Jessica stood next to her looking appropriately somber. I stood on the other side, feeling like an outsider at my own father's funeral. Several of my dad's friends and colleagues pulled me aside to say nice things about him, to tell me how proud he was of me, how often he talked about my success. One older guy, someone who'd known my dad for decades, gave me this meaningful look and said my dad had been a smart man who always planned ahead. At the time, I just thought he was being nice. After the funeral, Patricia announced that the will reading would be in 1 week at the office of my dad's estate lawyer. Very formal, Very official. Said it was what my dad wanted. That week was weird. I stayed in a hotel rather than at the house, partly because I didn't want to deal with Patricia any more than necessary, partly because that house had never really been my home. Patricia was suddenly very friendly, calling to check in, inviting me to dinner, acting like we'd always had a great relationship. It felt wrong, like she was performing. The day of the will reading arrived. The lawyer's office was one of those old-school places with wood paneling and leather chairs and law books lining the walls. Very traditional, very proper. The lawyer, this guy named Richard Holloway, was probably in his 60s, with white hair and glasses and this calm, professional demeanor. Patricia arrived dressed like she was going to a business meeting. Power suit, hair perfect, makeup on point. Jessica came with her, also dressed up. I showed up in slacks and a button-down, looking probably like I'd rather be literally anywhere else. We sat down in Richard's office, Patricia and Jessica on one side, me on the other. Richard had this thick folder in front of him, legal documents stacked neatly. He started with the standard legal language, reading from the documents, explaining the process. Very formal, very by the book. Got through the preliminary stuff about the estate, the assets, the various accounts and properties. Then he got to the specific bequests. Started with some smaller things. A donation to a local charity my dad had supported. Some money to his business partner, as thanks for years of friendship and professional collaboration. A few personal items to various relatives and friends. Then Richard paused, looked up at us, and said he'd now read the primary distributions, as outlined in the most recent version of the will, updated 3 months before my dad's capacity was legally compromised. Here's where it gets good. Patricia literally sat forward in her chair, this smile on her face like she was about to hear the best news of her life. Jessica mirrored her, both of them looking like sharks that had smelled blood in the water. Richard started reading. The house would go to Patricia, which made sense legally since she'd lived there, and it was the marital home. Some other assets, some accounts, division of property, all fairly standard stuff for a surviving spouse. Then he got to the business. My dad's accounting firm, which was worth a substantial amount. Richard read that the firm would be transferred to the existing business partner, with the stipulation that a significant portion of the sale proceeds would be placed in trust. Patricia's smile faltered a bit but held. She'd probably expected to get the firm outright, but the partner arrangement wasn't terrible for her. Then Richard got to the investment accounts. My dad had been a financial planner's dream client. Consistent savings, smart investments, decades of compound growth. We're talking substantial money here. Richard looked directly at me and read that the primary investment portfolio, worth approximately $2.7 million, would be transferred to me immediately upon settlement of the estate. I felt my stomach drop. That was way more than I'd expected. Way more than my dad had ever hinted at. I'd known about the trust from when I was a teenager, but I'd figured it was maybe a couple $100,000. Not life-changing money. Patricia's face went completely white, then red, then this mottled combination of both. But Richard wasn't done. He continued reading. There was a secondary portfolio, specifically designated for education and support, worth approximately $800,000. This portfolio had originally been earmarked for both children's benefit, but per the most recent update, it was now being distributed differently. Jessica would receive $50,000 as a one-time payment. The remaining $750,000 would be added to my inheritance. The silence in that office was deafening. Jessica looked like someone had slapped her. Patricia looked like she was about to have a stroke. I just sat there in shock, trying to process what I was hearing. Richard, professional as always, kept reading. There were stipulations, conditions, explanations in my dad's own words about why he'd structured things this way. That's when Patricia stood up, just shot to her feet like she'd been launched from a catapult, knocking her chair backward. Her face was purple now, veins standing out on her neck, hands shaking. She started yelling, actually screaming in this lawyer's office, saying this was impossible, that my dad had promised her everything would be taken care of, that Jessica deserved more, that I had manipulated a sick old man, that this will was clearly invalid because my dad wasn't in his right mind when he updated it. Richard, calm as could be, waited for her to run out of steam. Then he very carefully explained that the will had been updated 3 months before my dad was legally deemed incapacitated, that he'd been evaluated by 2 independent doctors who confirmed his mental competency at the time, and that every legal requirement had been meticulously followed. Patricia wasn't hearing it. She turned on me, started screaming about how I'd abandoned my father, how I'd barely visited, how I didn't deserve a single penny of his money. How dare I take what rightfully belonged to her and Jessica? how I was a selfish, ungrateful son who'd caused my father nothing but pain. Jessica joined in, tears streaming down her face, wailing about how unfair this was, how she'd given up her career to take care of him, how she'd sacrificed everything. I just sat there, didn't say a word, let them rant and scream and make complete fools of themselves in front of a lawyer who'd probably seen some drama in his day, but nothing quite like this. Finally, Richard held up his hand, asked Patricia and Jessica to please sit down. They didn't. Patricia actually grabbed the will from his desk, started reading through it herself like she'd find some loophole or error. That's when she found the letter. Tucked in the back of the will documents was a sealed envelope with my name on it, written in my dad's handwriting, labeled as supplementary context to the will. Patricia tried to open it. Richard very firmly told her that was a federal offense, that the letter was addressed to me and legally protected. She threw it at me instead, literally threw it across the desk like a frisbee. I picked it up, looked at Richard. He nodded, said I could open it now or in private, whatever I preferred. I opened it right there. Figured we'd come this far, might as well finish it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, dated from 3 months before my dad's decline really accelerated. His handwriting was shaky but legible, and just seeing it made my throat tight. He started by apologizing, said he knew he hadn't protected me the way he should have when I was growing up, that he'd let Patricia make me feel unwelcome in my own home, that he'd prioritized keeping the peace over standing up for his son, said it was his greatest regret. Then he explained. When he'd married Patricia, he'd kept his finances somewhat separate, maintained certain accounts in only his name, partially because he'd learned some hard lessons from his first marriage about financial planning, partially because something in his gut told him to protect what he'd built. Over the years, he'd watched Patricia's true nature reveal itself, the way she treated me versus Jessica, the way she spent money and demanded things and played the victim whenever she didn't get her way, how she'd tried to isolate him from his friends, control his decisions, manipulate situations to benefit herself and Jessica. He'd realized years ago that Patricia had married him for financial security and status, not love, that she'd seen a widower with a successful business and a young son as an opportunity, not a family. But he'd also realized he was trapped. If he divorced her, she'd get half of everything in the state we lived in. She'd make it ugly and expensive and drag it out. And more importantly, he was getting older. His health was starting to decline, and he didn't want to spend his remaining years in bitter legal battles. So he'd done the next best thing. He'd meticulously structured his finances and his will to ensure that Patricia would get enough to survive comfortably, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to at his expense. The house, some accounts, enough to live on. But the real wealth, the investments and business proceeds, those would go to me. Jessica's reduced inheritance was because my dad had been supporting her financially for nearly a decade after college, paying her rent and expenses and acting classes and headshots, and basically funding her entire unemployed actress lifestyle. He'd calculated that he'd already given her over $200,000 in support during that time. The $50,000 in the will was her final payment. After that, she was on her own. The letter went on, said he'd known Patricia would react badly, that she'd probably try to contest the will or make accusations. That's why he'd been so careful about the documentation, the competency evaluations, the timeline. He'd built a legal fortress around his final wishes because he knew Patricia would try to tear it down. He finished by telling me he loved me, that he was proud of the man I'd become, that I'd succeeded despite Patricia's interference rather than because of any help from her. Said I'd earned this inheritance not just through genetics, but through character, through independence, through building a life that didn't rely on anyone else's money or approval. The last line got me. He wrote, "You're a better man than I was, son. You got out. I should have too. Make good use of this, and live the life I was too afraid to choose." I looked up from the letter. My eyes were wet, but I wasn't crying. I was just overwhelmed by this final gift from my dad. Not just the money, but the acknowledgement, the apology, the explanation. Patricia had been reading over my shoulder somehow. I don't know when she'd moved, but she'd seen at least some of it. Her face had gone from red to this grayish color. She opened her mouth. And this is where we get to the moment that makes this whole story worth telling. Patricia, standing there in this lawyer's office, pulled herself up to her full height and announced in this formal, imperious voice, "This will was clearly written under duress, and I'm exercising my rights as surviving spouse to contest it. Furthermore, as primary caregiver during his final years, I'm claiming that I'm entitled to the full estate. And finally, I'm officially informing everyone present that I am cutting this ungrateful, manipulative man from any inheritance whatsoever. He gets nothing." There was a beat of silence. And then Richard Holloway started laughing. Not a chuckle, not a polite cough. Full on, head back, belly laughing. This dignified, professional lawyer in his wood-paneled office just lost it completely. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. What is so funny? Richard composed himself, wiped his eyes. Mrs. Patterson, I apologize for my unprofessional reaction, but you cannot cut someone out of a will at the reading. That's not how any of this works. The will has already been executed per your late husband's wishes. You have no legal authority to change its terms retroactively. What you just announced is the legal equivalent of declaring yourself Queen of England. Meaningless. Patricia's face went through about 15 different expressions in 3 seconds. Richard continued, still smiling. Furthermore, contesting this will would require you to prove either undue influence, lack of mental capacity, or procedural irregularities. Your late husband was evaluated by 2 independent psychiatrists who confirmed his competency. The will was witnessed by 3 unrelated parties. Every legal requirement was exceeded. You're welcome to waste money on lawyers who will tell you the same thing I'm telling you now, but I can guarantee you will lose, and likely be required to pay court costs and possibly sanctions for filing a frivolous contest. He picked up another document from his stack. Additionally, your husband anticipated this reaction. There's a no contest clause in the will. If you attempt to contest it and lose, which you will, you forfeit even the inheritance you were granted. The house, the accounts, all of it would be liquidated and added to the charitable donations. You'd get nothing. Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. Richard wasn't finished. As for your claim as primary caregiver, I have here documentation showing that your late husband's care was primarily provided by professional nursing staff that he paid for through his health insurance and personal funds. Your role as caregiver is noted in the will as appreciated, but not considered legal grounds for altering the inheritance distribution. Jessica had sat back down at some point, head in her hands. Patricia was still standing, but swaying slightly like she might pass out. Richard looked at me. Mr. Patterson, your inheritance is clear and legally sound. The estate will be settled within 60 to 90 days. I'll need to schedule a meeting to go over the details of the accounts, the trust structure, and the transfer process. Whenever you're ready. I nodded, still processing everything. Patricia finally found her voice. It came out as this strangled whisper. He promised. He promised me we'd be taken care of. Richard's expression softened slightly. And you are being taken care of, Mrs. Patterson. You're receiving the marital home free and clear, approximately $400,000 in various accounts, and a monthly distribution from a separate fund your husband set up that will provide you with $3,500 for the rest of your life. That's more than many widows receive, and more than sufficient for a comfortable lifestyle. That's not nearly enough, Patricia said. The house has a mortgage. There are expenses. Jessica needs support while she establishes her career. The house mortgage will be paid off as part of the estate settlement, Richard said. And Jessica is 32 years old with a college degree. Your late husband felt she'd received adequate support to establish her independence. The full reality was hitting Patricia now. She wasn't getting the millions she'd probably assumed would be hers. She was getting enough to survive, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. No more funding Jessica's acting dreams indefinitely. No more pretending to be wealthier than she was. No more looking down on everyone else from her perch as the wife of a successful businessman. She'd spent 3 decades being terrible to me, treating me like an inconvenient obligation, making my childhood and teenage years miserable. And my dad had been watching it all, taking notes, planning his revenge from beyond the grave. And the best part? It was all perfectly legal. Airtight. She couldn't do anything about it except accept reality. Patricia grabbed Jessica's arm. We're leaving. I'm calling our own lawyer. This isn't over. Richard, back to being professionally calm, said, You're welcome to seek legal counsel, Mrs. Patterson. I'll have my office send you copies of all relevant documents. Have a good day. They left. Patricia practically dragged Jessica out of there, both of them looking like their entire world had just collapsed. Which, in a way, it had. I sat there in silence for a minute after they left. Richard waited patiently. Did you know? I finally asked. When you started reading, did you know she'd react like that? Richard smiled. Your father and I met several times during the will preparation. He knew exactly how his wife would react. In fact, he predicted her response almost word for word. The no contest clause was his idea. He wanted to ensure she couldn't use anger and lawyers to undo his final wishes. The competency evaluations? Also his idea. He insisted on being over-evaluated, wanted the documentation to be undeniable. He said he'd spent too many years letting his wife manipulate situations, and he wasn't going to let her manipulate his death too. I nodded slowly, looking at the letter still in my hands. He planned all of this. He did. He was quite determined. Said he owed you better than he'd given you in life, and he was going to make sure you got it in death. Richard paused. For what it's worth, your father spoke very highly of you. He said you were the one thing he'd done completely right. Yeah, that got me. Had to look away for a minute. We scheduled the follow-up meeting. Richard walked me out, shook my hand, told me to call if I had any questions. I walked to my car, got in, and just sat there for a while. My phone started buzzing. Text from a number I didn't recognize. Then realized it was Jessica's new number. Long, rambling messages about how I'd ruined everything. How I was heartless. How could I take everything from them? How my dad would be ashamed of me. I blocked the number. Then Patricia called from her phone. I let it go to voicemail. She left a 5-minute message that was basically just screaming and accusations and threats to contest the will, even though we both knew that was financial suicide for her. Blocked that number too. Over the next few weeks, they tried other approaches. Patricia attempted to friend mutual family members on Facebook to get them to pressure me into giving up part of the inheritance. Didn't work. Most of the family had seen how she'd treated me over the years and had no sympathy for her situation. Jessica tried the sympathy angle, posting vague Instagram stories about family betrayal and how money corrupts people and how she'd learned who her real family was. Her comment section was full of her theater friends posting supportive messages without actually knowing any context. Patricia even tried to show up at my condo once. Building security called me before letting her up, and I told them she wasn't welcome. She apparently stood in the lobby for 20 minutes, demanding to speak to me before finally leaving. The estate settled exactly as Richard said it would. The money transferred, the accounts closed, everything processed. I paid off my condo, invested most of the inheritance conservatively, kept working because I actually liked my job. The house went to Patricia as stated. Last I heard, she was trying to sell it because she couldn't afford the property taxes and upkeep on her reduced income. She'd have to downsize significantly. Jessica moved back to New York, presumably back to her struggling actress life, except now without parental funding. Her Instagram got a lot quieter after that. My dad's business partner called me a few months after everything settled. Said he wanted me to know that my dad had talked about me constantly at work, that everyone at the firm knew I was the son who'd made something of himself, who didn't need handouts, who'd earned his success. Said my dad was prouder of me than he'd probably ever expressed directly. That conversation helped more than the money did, honestly. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel and help us bring you more and better stories. Thanks. Stories. Thanks. Stories. Thanks. Stories. Thanks.